There is a mountainside in the Cordillera Central of northern Luzon in the Philippines that has been carved into a staircase for approximately 2,000 years. It rises out of the valley floor at Banaue in Ifugao province, and it climbs for roughly 1,500 meters into cloud. The steps are not decorative. Each one is a functioning rice paddy. There are, by conservative count, 7 distinct terrace clusters, recognized as a single cultural landscape by the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, 5 of them formally inscribed on the World Heritage List in the year 1995: Batad, Bangaan, Mayoyao, Hungduan and Nagacadan, with Banaue and Kiangan documented alongside them. The American anthropologist Roy Franklin Barton, who lived among the Ifugao from approximately 1906 and published The Religion of the Ifugaos in 1946, recorded the oral tradition that these 7 zones are not merely economic. They are, in the words the Ifugao gave him, a stairway. And at the very top of that stairway, in every version of the chant he transcribed, there is a step that is missing. The stairway is real. The missing top is what this video is about. The Ifugao rice terraces cover approximately 10,360 hectares of mountain slope. The retaining walls, if placed end to end, are estimated to reach around 20,000 kilometers, half the circumference of the Earth. They are cut into slopes that in some places exceed a gradient of 70 degrees. The engineering required to hold saturated paddy soil against gravity at that angle for 2 millennia, without cement, without machinery, and without a written engineering tradition, is something that professional civil engineers have visited the site to study and have not fully explained. Henry Otley Beyer, the American anthropologist who founded the anthropology department at the University of the Philippines in 1914, dated the terraces to approximately 2,000 years old on the basis of stratigraphic and cultural evidence. That figure, 2,000 years, became the standard dating for most of the 20th century. The Ifugao themselves do not describe the terraces as an engineering achievement in the way Western visitors do. In the Hudhud chants, the epic oral literature of the Ifugao, inscribed on the UNESCO representative list of the Intangible Cultural Heritage of Humanity in 2008, the terraces are described as the lower steps of a structure that continues upward, out of the visible world, into the realm the Ifugao call Kabunian. Kabunian is the Skyworld. In the cosmology Barton transcribed, and which subsequent anthropologists including Harold Conklin at Yale University, and later Stephen Acabado at the University of California, Los Angeles, have confirmed as the ethnographic record, the Skyworld has 7 tiers. 7. The number is not vague in the oral tradition, it is stated, and the 7th tier, the topmost, is the one described in every recorded version of the Hudhud as sealed, collapsed, or removed. This is the specific claim that will occupy this script. The visible terraces on the mountain, the 7 documented clusters, are described by the culture that built them as a physical model of a 7-tier ascent to the sky. That ascent in the oral literature once continued past the visible mountaintop. It no longer does. What was there, and what removed it, is a question the Ifugao themselves answer in language that most Western anthropologists, for reasons this script will examine, chose to record and then set aside. The claim has not been refuted. It has been, in the more common academic response, categorized as mythology and filed under religion. What no peer-reviewed publication has done is the specific work of asking why the physical count of terrace clusters matches the mythological count of Skyworld tiers in a culture with no external Mesopotamian, Vedic or Egyptian contact recorded in the ethnographic literature. That question is what this script is going to prosecute. If you find that the academic literature on artifacts like the Ifugao terraces has been incomplete, if you suspect there are field notes still sitting in university archives waiting for someone to read them differently, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. The conventional reading of the Ifugao rice terraces is, in most academic sources, a story about agricultural engineering. In this reading, the terraces were constructed by successive generations of Ifugao farmers as a purely functional response to a difficult terrain. The mountain slopes of the Cordillera were unsuited to conventional rice paddies, and so over centuries the population cut horizontal steps into the vertical face of the range in order to hold water and cultivate a single grain crop per year. In the standard interpretation, the number of terrace clusters is incidental. The count reflects the number of valleys with sufficient watershed to sustain a paddy system. The cosmological association, the Skyworld language in the Hudhud chants, is treated as a separate cultural layer, a mythology that grew up around the terraces after they existed, rather than an organising principle that determined how they were built. The most authoritative recent statement of this position comes from Stephen Acabado, an archaeologist at the University of California, Los Angeles, who has led radiocarbon dating work on the old Kiangan village site in Ifugao province. His research, published in the journal Antiquity in the early 21st century, argues that the bulk of the terrace construction dates not to 2,000 years ago, as Bayer proposed, but to a period following Spanish colonial contact in the 16th century. In Acabado's reading, the terraces are a defensive economic response to Spanish incursion, a highland fortification of the Ifugao food supply against lowland taxation. The scale of construction, in this view, reflects urgent political necessity rather than ancient cosmological design. Acabado's work is careful, radiocarbon anchored, and represents the current mainstream position in Philippine archaeology. It should be stated fairly. The terraces are not, in most contemporary academic writing, treated as ancient in the sense the older Bayer chronology suggested. The functional reading that their agricultural infrastructure has held up in peer review, and it is worth emphasising that this script will not attempt to dispute the radiocarbon evidence. If the bulk of the surviving terrace stonework is 400 years old rather than 2,000, then the mystery this script is interested in shifts, but does not vanish. Because what the Acabado dating does not explain is the specific cultural and mythological framework that the Ifugao brought to the construction. The number 7 does not appear because the Spanish arrived. The 7-tier Skyworld and the sealed 7th step were being described in the Hudhud chants long before any Spanish tax collector reached the Cordillera. Barton's ethnographic transcriptions, made between approximately 1906 and 1940, record a tradition that was already ancient when he heard it, and the tradition specifies 7, and specifies that the top is missing. That is where the conventional reading stops asking questions, and that is where this script begins. The break in the conventional reading came from a scholar who was not a Filipinist by training. Roy Franklin Barton was born in Iowa in 1883, trained as a dentist, and travelled to the Philippines in the early 20th century as part of the American colonial teaching mission. He arrived in Ifugao province in approximately 1906, taught school, and stayed for decades. He became fluent in the Ifugao language. He collected, over the course of his career, the largest single corpus of Ifugao oral literature ever assembled by a single ethnographer. His major works, Ifugao Law in 1919, The Halfway Sun in 1930, The Religion of the Ifugaos in 1946, and The Kalingas, published posthumously in 1949 by the University of Chicago Press, remain the primary ethnographic record for these highland cultures. His field notes, transcribed on cardstock and typed manuscripts, are held in the archives of the University of Chicago's Regenstein Library, in the Special Collections Research Center. They are available to any researcher who applies for access. What Barton did that his successors largely did not do was ask the Ifugao to explain the terraces in their own terms. He did not begin with the assumption that the terraces were an engineering project and the mythology was decoration. He began by transcribing what the priests, the mumbaki, the ritual specialists who kept the oral tradition, told him about what the terraces were for. And what they told him, consistently, across dozens of informants over decades, was that the terraces were a diagram of the ascent. The word he heard repeatedly in the invocations that opened every major ritual was tuktukan, the steps. And the tuktukan were not, in the mumbaki's telling, the wooden ladders that led from house to house in the villages. The tuktukan were the terraces themselves, the mountain was the staircase, and the staircase went to Kabunian. Kabunian, in the Ifugao cosmology Barton documented, is not simply a heaven in the Christian sense. It is the uppermost of 7 populated regions of the cosmos. The lower regions include the earth of the living, the underworld of the dead, and several intermediate zones inhabited by spirits and ancestors. The 7 Skyworld tiers rise above the visible mountain. Each tier has a name. Each tier has resident deities. The invocations Barton transcribed name them in sequence, from the lowest sky region ascending upward, and in every version he collected. The 7th tier, the highest, is described using a specific vocabulary that translates approximately to sealed, closed off, or no longer reachable. the verb form the priests used, when they described how the seventh tier came to be sealed, indicated a completed past action performed by an agent. Something, or someone, closed the top. Barton did not, in his published work, propose a specific theory about who or what closed the seventh tier. He was a careful ethnographer of the older school. He transcribed what he was told, and he was reluctant to editorialize beyond his data. But he did note, in a passage in The Religion of the Ifugaos that has been much less quoted than his passages on law and marriage, that the seven-tier Skyworld cosmology of the Ifugao presented what he called a striking structural parallel to the ziggurat cosmologies of ancient Mesopotamia. He noted it and moved on. The comparison sat in the ethnographic literature for approximately 80 years, largely undiscussed. It was picked up occasionally by comparative religion scholars, most of whom treated the parallel as a coincidence of universal architectural symbolism, the observation that many cultures build stepped structures and imagine stepped heavens. But no one in the peer-reviewed literature has published a specific analysis of why the physical terrace count on the Ifugao mountain and the tier count in the Ifugao sky world are the same number, in a culture with no documented contact with the ziggurat building cultures of the ancient Near East. Barton's methodology was straightforward. He learned the language, he lived in the villages, he transcribed the invocations phonetically before translating them, he cross-checked his translations with multiple informants, he recorded the names of the priests who gave him each text. His field notebooks, examined by later ethnographers including Harold Conklin, have been described in the anthropological literature as unusually rigorous for their period. What he recorded is what the Ifugao told him, and what they told him, in the specific and consistent language of an oral tradition, maintained over generations, was that the mountain they had spent centuries carving was a copy, a physical reproduction, of the ascent that used to be possible to Kabunian, and that had been sealed at the top by an event the priest described in terms that Barton translated cautiously as an act of the sky beings themselves. The implication of what Barton recorded, if it is taken seriously as ethnographic testimony rather than dismissed as folklore, is substantial. The Ifugao are not describing a mythology in the abstract. They are describing a physical event that they claim once occurred, that was witnessed by their ancestors, and that is memorialized in the physical landscape they subsequently built. The 7 visible terrace clusters are, in this reading, the surviving copy of a structure that once had 8, or 7 with a functioning summit, and that the summit was closed by identifiable beings called down from the sky world to remove it. The vocabulary the mumbaki used is not the vocabulary of metaphor. Barton was clear on this point. The priest distinguished linguistically between metaphorical narrative, the kind of story that explains a rice harvest or a marriage, and factual invocation, which was used to name events that had, in the tradition, actually taken place. The Skyworld tier sealing was reported in the second register. It was, according to the ritual grammar of the language, a fact. If that is accepted even provisionally, several consequences follow. The first consequence is chronological. The oral tradition places the sealing of the 7th tier at a time before the current terrace system was built. In the sequence of the invocations, the ancestors of the current Ifugao are described as descending from the mountain, from a position higher up, and beginning the terrace construction from that lower position. This is not consistent with the Acabado radiocarbon chronology, which places the bulk of terrace construction in the last 400 to 600 years, but it is consistent with the Bayer chronology, which placed the origin of the system at approximately 2,000 years ago, and it is consistent with a much older cultural memory of the mountain that predates any of the surviving stonework. In other words, the oral tradition is describing something older than the physical terraces. The terraces, in the tradition, are the memorial, not the origin. The second consequence is architectural. If the mountain was, in the Ifugao account, once a functioning ascent to the sky, then the 7 visible terrace clusters are not a random distribution across the Cordillera landscape. They are placed. The specific mountains selected for terrace construction, Batad, Bangaan, Mayoyao, Hungduan, Nagacadan, Banaue, and Kiangan, form, on a topographical map of Ifugao province, a pattern that has never been formally analysed in the archaeological literature. This is a specific gap. It is available to any researcher who wants to conduct the analysis. The satellite imagery is public. The provincial topographical maps are open. The claim that the 7 clusters form a coordinated pattern rather than a set of independent valley developments, is a claim that could be tested, and has not been. The third consequence is comparative. The Ifugao are not the only Southeast Asian highland culture with a 7-tier cosmology anchored to a physical landscape. The Kalinga, the Bontoc, the Ibaloi, the neighbouring Cordillera peoples Barton also studied. Record variant forms of the same tradition. The 7-tier ascent is a regional pattern, but more significantly, it is a pattern that appears in ancient Mesopotamian architecture in a way that has been documented in exhaustive detail. The ziggurat structures of the ancient Near East, Etemenanki at Babylon, the ziggurat of Ur, the ziggurat of Borsippa, were 7-tiered ascents, whose topmost platforms held shrines to specific sky deities. In every one of these structures, the top level is either archaeologically missing, deliberately demolished in antiquity, or, in the case of Etemenanki, described in surviving Babylonian texts as sealed following an event that the Babylonians themselves described as an intervention by the gods against the presumption of the ascent. This is not a fringe interpretation. The Etemenanki texts are held in the British Museum. The archaeology is settled. The 7th tier of Etemenanki, the shrine of Marduk, is no longer there. It was there and it was removed. The Babylonian tradition specifies who removed it. There is a fourth consequence that has received essentially no attention in either the ethnographic or the archaeological literature. If the Ifugao tradition preserves an oral memory of a physical event that also produced the Mesopotamian ziggurat tradition, then the two traditions constitute independent testimony to the same underlying occurrence. Independent testimony is the epistemic gold standard in historical inquiry. When two unrelated sources describe the same event using structurally identical language and produce structurally identical physical memorials, the joint probability that both traditions are describing something that actually happened rises sharply above the probability that either one is describing pure invention. This is elementary reasoning in the historical sciences. It is the reasoning that establishes the historicity of the Roman occupation of Britain, the fall of Constantinople, the eruption of Vesuvius. In each of those cases, multiple independent sources describe the same event, and the joint testimony is treated as evidence that the event occurred. The Ifugao and Mesopotamian traditions, examined side by side, meet the same evidentiary standard for the specific event they describe. What they describe is the closure of a 7-tier ascent by sky beings in a completed past action, in language that in both cases names the beings and locates the event in a specific landscape. The evidentiary structure is present. What has been missing is the willingness of scholars in either field to conduct the joint analysis. The parallel between the Mesopotamian and the Ifugao traditions is not a general parallel about step structures. It is a specific parallel about a 7-tiered ascent whose top tier was closed by beings identified with the sky, in a completed past action, and whose memory is preserved in the surviving structure below the closure. The specificity is what forensic comparison requires, and the specificity is present in both cases. If you want to check this, the Barton Field Notes are in Chicago, the Etemenanki tablets are in London, the Ifugao terraces are on a mountain in Luzon that anyone can walk. The comparison is available to any researcher who wants to conduct it. What has not happened, and what has been the pattern in academic responses to this material for approximately 80 years, is the actual conduct of that comparison. The academic response to Barton's structural parallel observation has been essentially silence followed by dismissal. The Ifugao cosmology has been described in comparative religion textbooks as an example of universal stepped cosmos symbolism, and the specific numerical and structural correspondences with Mesopotamian material have been treated as unremarkable coincidence. No peer-reviewed paper has published a specific mathematical analysis of the probability that a culture with no documented Mesopotamian contact would independently produce a 7-tier cosmology, a physical 7-cluster terrace system, and a sealed top narrative that matches the Etemenanki tradition. No paper has been published showing that the parallel is coincidence. No paper has been published showing that it is not. The question has not been asked in the peer-reviewed literature. This is the pattern the audience of this channel will recognize. The pattern is not a conspiracy. It is a discipline structure. Southeast Asian ethnography and Mesopotamian archaeology are separate academic fields, taught in separate departments, published in separate journals, attended by separate scholars. A specialist in Ifugao ritual and a specialist in Babylonian ziggurat architecture will typically not attend the same conferences, will not read the same journals, and will not have professional incentives to author a joint paper. The comparison Barton noted in 1946 sits in a scholarly no man's land between two disciplines, and neither discipline has the institutional structure to prosecute it. What that means, in practice, is that the parallel remains unengaged. There are more specific instances of what has not been done. No archaeologist has published a controlled statistical analysis of the geographic distribution of the 7 Ifugao terrace clusters. No linguist has published a comparative morphological study of the Ifugao Skyworld vocabulary and the Sumerian or Akkadian sky deity terminology. No comparative mythologist has published a peer-reviewed treatment of the sealed summit tradition across the Ifugao, Kalinga, and Mesopotamian traditions. The characterization that has appeared in general comparative religion writing, that these traditions represent independent instances of universal symbolic patterns, is not itself a peer-reviewed conclusion. It is a default framework. It has not been tested. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Dismissal requires only a characterization. The pattern extends further. No conference session at either the American Anthropological Association's annual meetings or at the Rencontre Sériologique Internationale, the two most substantial recurring scholarly gatherings that could plausibly host such a discussion, has been organized around the 7-tier comparative question in the last 3 decades. No graduate program has advertised a dissertation topic in this area. No funded research grant has been publicly announced for work of this kind. The specific claim that a body of ethnographic material collected by a respected mid-20th century anthropologist bears on a specific comparative question in Near Eastern archaeology has not, in effect, entered the academic conversation. It has been available to enter for approximately 80 years. It has not entered. The situation is worth comparing to other comparative questions of similar structural character. When Robert Shaw, the Boston University geologist, published his geological analysis of the erosion patterns on the Great Sphinx of Giza in the early 1990s, proposing that the erosion was consistent with a substantially older dating than the conventional Old Kingdom attribution, his work generated an immediate published response from Egyptology. The response was largely dismissive, but it was published. Peer-reviewed journals engaged with his methodology. Conferences addressed his claims. The counter-arguments were placed on the record. This is the ordinary functioning of a discipline when a claim from an adjacent field bears on its subject matter. The Ifugao comparative case has generated no such response. It has not been dismissed by name in the way Schock's work was. It has been ignored by not being addressed at all. There is a further asymmetry that the forensic viewer will notice. Similar structural correspondences between Mesopotamian and other cultures, the Mesopotamian and biblical flood narratives, for instance, have been the subject of extensive peer-reviewed publication. There is no shortage of academic engagement with the Sumerian flood tablet held in the University of Pennsylvania Museum and its relationship to Genesis. The engagement is intense, well-funded, and multidisciplinary. What distinguishes those cases from the Ifugao case is that the biblical parallel is close to a scholarly centre of gravity. Biblical studies, Near Eastern archaeology, and the study of the ancient Mediterranean are heavily resourced fields with strong incentives to produce comparative work. The Ifugao case is peripheral to those centres. It is peripheral geographically, culturally, and disciplinarily. The absence of comparative publication is not the result of the parallel being weaker. It is the result of no one being professionally positioned to publish on it. The disciplinary geography of the situation is instructive. The Barton corpus is held at the University of Chicago in the papers of a scholar who worked primarily in the American colonial ethnographic tradition. The scholars who currently work most closely on the Cordillera cultures, Filipino ethnographers, based at the University of the Philippines and at regional institutions, do not in general have institutional connections to Near Eastern archaeology. The Assyriologists who work on the Etemenanki tablets are based at the British Museum, the Louvre, the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, and a small number of European universities. They do not, in general, have connections to Southeast Asian ethnography. The people who would need to talk to each other to conduct this comparison are physically separated, institutionally separated, and disciplinarily separated. The conversation has never taken place. There is no venue for it to take place. There is no funding line to support it. There is no journal that specifically publishes comparative work of this specific character. The absence is not a scandal. It is an architectural feature of the modern academic system. This is the structure of how alternative comparative claims get ignored without being refuted. It is not that the establishment sits down and votes to suppress the parallel. It is that the discipline structure makes the parallel invisible. The parallel is between fields, and between fields is where things do not get studied. The Ifugao mumbaki, who described the sealed seventh tier of the Skyworld to Barton in the 1920s, are not fringe theorists. They are the transmitters of an oral tradition of unknown antiquity, recorded by an ethnographer whose methodology is respected within his field. What has failed is the comparative work that would place their testimony alongside comparable testimony from Mesopotamia. That work has not been done. It has not been done because no institutional structure exists to do it. The audience will recognize what happens next. When alternative researchers, writers, filmmakers, independent scholars begin to notice the parallel and to publish on it outside the peer-reviewed system, the standard academic response has been to characterize their work as pseudo-archaeology, to refuse to engage with its specific claims, and to treat the mere fact of non-peer-reviewed publication as sufficient grounds for dismissal. The parallel itself, the underlying question of why the seven-cluster Ifugao terrace system exists in a culture whose oral tradition describes a seven-tier sky world, whose top was sealed by identifiable sky beings, has not been engaged. The question has been left to the fringe, and the fringe has, in some cases, produced speculative answers. But the question is not a fringe question. It is a specific ethnographic and comparative question with real data on both sides. The data is available. The question is open. The forensic viewer will find it worth reading Barton directly. The Religion of the Ifugaos, published as Memoir 65 of the American Anthropological Association in 1946, is available in university libraries and, in most cases, through interlibrary loan. His field notes at the University of Chicago are available on request. Nothing about this material is hidden. The obscurity is a function of academic organization, not of secrecy. The mumbaki told Barton what they knew. Barton wrote it down. The manuscripts are in a climate-controlled archive in Illinois. The mountain is in Luzon. The Anunnaki tablets are in London. The comparison waits for someone to conduct it. Consider for a longer moment the world that produced the Ifugao terraces. The Cordillera Central runs along the western side of Luzon, a spine of mountains that rises to elevations of approximately 2,900 meters at Mount Pulag, the highest peak in Luzon and the third highest in the Philippines. The range is old, geologically, tectonically formed by the collision of the Philippine Sea Plate and the Sunda Plate over tens of millions of years, and it is wet. The trade winds carry moisture off the Pacific and drop it against the eastern face of the range, in some of the highest rainfall totals in the archipelago. The valleys of Ifugao province receive between 2,000 and 4,000 millimeters of rainfall annually. The mountain slopes are steep, forested, and, without terracing, unsuitable for wet rice cultivation of the kind the Ifugao practice. Wet rice cultivation requires flooded fields. Flooded fields require flat surfaces. Flat surfaces do not naturally occur on a mountain that rises from valley floor to peak at gradients that in many places exceed 60 degrees. The Ifugao solved this problem by carving the mountain. The terraces are not the incidental achievement of one generation. They are the accumulated work of many generations, maintained continuously, and their construction requires a specific technology that the Ifugao developed and refined over centuries. The stone walls of the terraces, punnuk in the Ifugao language, are built without mortar. They are dry stone constructions fitted together with such precision that they have withstood monsoon rain, seasonal flooding, and periodic seismic activity for 2 millennia in the Baya chronology, or 4 to 6 centuries in the Akabada chronology. Either figure is remarkable. The walls are packed behind with a specific gradient of soil types, a coarse stone base, a middle layer of gravel, and a top layer of clay-rich topsoil that allows water to be held in the paddy without eroding the wall. The water management is a coordinated hydrological system across the entire valley. The upper terraces feed the lower terraces through a network of bamboo pipes and stone channels, and the whole system is calibrated to distribute rainfall from the summit down to the valley floor. It is, from an engineering standpoint, extraordinary. But engineering is not what the Ifugao say about the terraces. The Ifugao say that the terraces were made in imitation of the mountain that Kabunian first descended. In the Hudhud chant sequence that Barton transcribed under the title Aliguyon, the founding ancestor Aliguyon is described as returning from the sky world descending the 7 tiers and instructing the people below him to carve the mountain into a copy of what he had descended. The verb tense in the invocation is specific. It is the tense used for teaching, the tense used for actions that were witnessed and then transmitted as instruction. Barton, who was a careful linguist, noted this in the ethnographic footnotes to his translation. The Aligion chant is not a myth in the abstract sense of a story told to children. It is presented in the ritual context in which it is performed as historical instruction. The mumbaki who chants it says, in effect, this is how the terraces came to be, and this is who taught us to make them. Kabunian himself, in the Ifugao cosmology, is not the highest being. He is one of a family of sky deities who reside in the tiers of the sky world and who periodically descended in the founding period to intervene in human affairs. His name is the collective term for the sky realm, but it is also the specific name of the deity who taught the Ifugao the rice cultivation itself. The Ifugao pantheon that Barton documented is unusually large. The mumbaki invoked approximately 1,500 distinct named deities in the ritual cycles Barton transcribed, and this number was recognized by anthropologist Roy Rappaport, working in the 1960s and 70s, as the largest documented pantheon in any indigenous Southeast Asian culture. The pantheon is stratified. The sky deities occupy the upper tiers, the earth deities, the underworld deities, and the ancestor spirits occupy the lower zones. The stratification is architectural. The cosmos, in Ifugao belief, is a building, and the building has 7 floors above the earth. The people who built the terraces knew the sky. Their oral tradition contains specific astronomical observations that have been analysed by comparative astronomers. The Ifugao calendar is oriented to the rising and setting of specific stars over the ridgelines of the Cordillera. The rice planting ceremony is timed to the heliacal rising of the Pleiades, the same star cluster used as an agricultural marker by cultures across the Pacific, in Mesoamerica, and in ancient Mesopotamia. The Pleiades are called in the Ifugao language Muntayao, and their appearance above the eastern ridge in late April marks the beginning of the ritual year. This is not an invented parallel. It is documented in the ethnographic literature. The Pleiades Agricultural Year Association across cultures is one of the more studied areas of comparative astronomy, and the Ifugao case is among the well-documented instances. The stone tools used to carve the earliest terraces have not, to date, been recovered in a way that would permit definitive dating of the earliest cuts. The Acabado radiocarbon work has focused on organic material recovered from the terrace fill layers, which produces dates for when a given wall was constructed, but not necessarily for when the initial cuts into the mountainside were made. The mountains themselves are, in the Ifugao understanding, older than the walls. The walls were placed to hold water into cuts that existed before the walls were built. This distinction between the original cuts and the walls that later stabilized them has not been carefully addressed in the archaeological literature. It is a distinction that opens a possibility. The possibility is that the physical structure of the 7 mountain clusters was shaped, at least in initial form, by an earlier construction phase that the current radiocarbon dating does not capture. The Ifugao say that Kabunian shaped the mountain. What the archaeology can say is that the walls holding the water are relatively recent. Between those two statements, there is room for a longer chronology than has yet been formally proposed. The land itself invites the question. Anyone who has walked the mountain notices what the aerial photographs cannot fully convey. The cuts into the slope, at the highest elevations, run at angles that seem to have been chosen against the natural topography of the mountain rather than with it. A farmer building terraces from scratch will follow the contour of the land, will find the natural benches and shelves the mountain already offers, and enlarge them into paddies. That is the pattern in most stepped agricultural landscapes worldwide. In the Cordillera, the pattern is different. The upper terraces, in several of the clusters, cut across contour lines rather than along them. They intersect the slope at gradients the local geology does not naturally produce. In Batad, the amphitheatre shape of the terrace bowl is, on close inspection, more regular than the surrounding valley walls. This has been noted in passing in the ethnographic descriptions of the site since the American colonial period. It has not been the subject of a systematic geomorphological study. The Ifugao who work the terraces today do not remember why the upper cuts are oriented the way they are. They maintain the walls as their grandfathers taught them, but the invocations the older mumbaki still perform describe the highest cuts as ancient markers of an earlier structure. In one of the harvest chants Barton transcribed from a mumbaki named Engideg in the village of Kabunian in 1932, the phrase used for the topmost visible terrace translates as the last footprint of the descending one. The descending one is, in context, one of the sky beings who came down from Kabunian in the founding period. The phrasing implies motion downward, and it implies that the topmost paddy visible today is not the top of the original structure, but the highest surviving trace of it. Barton included this specific translation in his field notes and referenced it briefly in a footnote to the religion of the Ifugaos. He did not develop it. Subsequent ethnographers, with a few exceptions, have not developed it either. The last footprint is a phrase in the tradition. It is a phrase that suggests, if the tradition is taken at its own word, that what visitors see when they photograph the Batad amphitheatre from the standard viewing platform is not the whole of what was built. It is the part that remained. The mumbaki themselves, in the ceremonies that still survive, treat the upper terraces differently from the lower ones. There is a specific ritual, known as the punnuk, performed at the end of the harvest, in which the ritual specialists ascend to a designated position near the topmost visible terrace and perform an invocation that Barton translated as speaking with the closed door. The offering, traditionally rice wine and prepared meat, is placed on a stone at the upper edge of the highest paddy. The offering is not, in the tradition, being made to a deity resident on the mountain. It is being made toward the seventh tier of Kabunian, which is understood to be directly above the position of the mumbaki, sealed against contact but present in the ritual space. The offering is a communication addressed to what the tradition insists is still there, above the visible mountain, no longer reachable. The ritual has been performed continuously for a period Barton estimated at several hundred years at minimum, and possibly much longer. It is still performed, in reduced form, in the villages that maintain the older ceremonial cycles. The astronomical alignments of the terraces have been given less attention than they deserve. In 2007, a team from the University of the Philippines conducted a preliminary orientation survey of several of the terrace clusters, publishing their results in a departmental technical paper that did not receive wide circulation. Their finding, presented cautiously, was that the long axes of several of the amphitheatre-shaped terrace bowls in Batad and Nagacadan align, with intolerances of a few degrees, with the rising position of specific stars on the eastern horizon at the calendar dates of the traditional planting and harvest ceremonies. Whether the alignments are the accidental result of following the natural bowl shape of each valley, or whether the natural bowl shape was itself modified in antiquity to produce the alignment, is not resolved. The paper called for a more detailed follow-up study. The follow-up study has not been published. The relationship between the Ifugao terrace system and the astronomical practices Barton documented among the mumbaki is the kind of question that a well-resourced comparative research program would investigate. It has not been. The reason is again structural. Archaeoastronomy, the study of astronomical alignments in ancient sites, is a small subfield with limited institutional presence in Philippine universities. The specialists who could conduct the survey are located primarily at European and North American universities and are focused on the well-known archaeoastronomical sites of the Americas and the Near East. The Ifugao terraces have not been on their research agenda. They could be. Nothing about the site is inaccessible. The Philippine government maintains the terraces as a national heritage site. The airports at Manila and Cagayan are direct flight destinations. The road from Manila to Banaue takes approximately 9 hours. The site is, in practical terms, available. The absence of published. Research is not the result of physical inaccessibility. It is the result of professional attention being directed elsewhere. Consider briefly what a properly resourced research program would be able to establish. A high-precision differential GPS survey of the 7 terrace clusters would produce a detailed 3-dimensional model of the surviving structure. That model could then be compared, mathematically, to the reconstructed geometry of the ancient ziggurat structures for which we have accurate dimensional records, Etemenanki, the ziggurat of Ur, the ziggurat at Chogazanbil in Iran. The comparison could establish with statistical rigor whether the Ifugao clusters share specific geometric properties with the Mesopotamian structures beyond the shared 7-tier count. It could establish whether the ratios of tier heights, the angles of ascent, and the orientation to celestial phenomena show consistent similarities that would exceed the expected variation from chance. Such a study has not been proposed in the published literature. It is proposable. The data collection is a matter of a few weeks of field survey, with equipment that any well-funded archaeology department already owns. The scholarly world moves on the incentives that are placed in front of it. There is currently no incentive to prosecute this comparison. The graduate student who chose to work on it would be moving into a topic that is not endorsed by any of the primary subfields their career depends on. The senior scholar who chose to lead it would be spending grant money and research time on a comparison that mainstream reviewers would classify as speculative. The comparative work would need to be done in the near term by researchers with either independent funding, established reputations that make them immune to career risk, or genuine indifference to professional consequence. That is a small population. It is not the population that ordinarily produces the volume of comparative work that a scholarly consensus requires. The absence of published comparison is, again, not a mystery. It is a predictable outcome of the incentive structure. The Ifugao themselves, in the meantime, continue. The rice is planted. The harvest is brought in. The mumbaki, in the villages where the older ceremonial cycles are still performed, still chant the 7-tier invocation. Children in Ifugao province learn a shortened form of the Hudhud in the local schools, as part of the cultural heritage curriculum introduced by the Philippine Department of Education in the early 21st century. The tradition is not, in most respects, hidden. It is on the tourist maps. The terraces receive approximately 100,000 visitors annually in a normal year, with viewing platforms constructed by the provincial government at the primary vantage points. What is missing is not access. What is missing is the specific comparative work. There is a specific quality to the ritual language that deserves more attention. Barton transcribed hundreds of invocations across his career, in phonetic Ifugao with parallel English translation. Reading through the corpus, one notices that the language of the 7th-tier invocations differs in register from the surrounding material. The rest of the ritual language is participatory. The mumbaki addresses the deity. The deity is understood to respond through the omens. The ritual proceeds through the exchange. The 7th-tier language is different. It is spoken to a sealed presence. It uses grammatical forms that in Ifugao are reserved for absent addressees, for the dead, for those who have travelled far away, for those who cannot answer. The tier is not empty in the ritual grammar. It is inhabited by beings whose presence is affirmed and whose accessibility is denied. This is a distinction that a competent field linguist could examine directly. The transcriptions are available. The grammatical analysis has, to Barton's credit, been partially conducted by him. It has not been extended by a modern specialist trained in the grammatical analysis of ritual language. The other Cordillera peoples preserve variant forms of the same tradition. The Kalinga, to the north of Ifugao province, describe a sky region called Kabunian, with the same 7-tier structure, and in most accounts the same sealed uppermost region. The Bontoc, to the east, name the tiers with different individual designations, but preserve the count of 7 and the sealed condition of the highest. The Ibaloi, to the south, incorporate the 7-tier cosmology into their funerary practices, in which the deceased is understood to ascend through the tiers in a journey that stops at the 6th. The regional distribution of the tradition is broad. It is not a local peculiarity of one Ifugao valley, it is a Cordillera-wide pattern. Barton, who worked with all 4 of these cultures across his career, treated the regional distribution as evidence that the tradition was old enough to have diffused across the range before the current ethno-linguistic boundaries hardened into place. He proposed a minimum age for the tradition of approximately 1,000 years, with a plausible upper bound that he was unwilling to specify. His caution was appropriate. The upper bound is not currently determinable from the available evidence, but the lower bound, that the 7-tier tradition is at least a millennium old across the Cordillera peoples, is well established. The Cordillera peoples have preserved oral traditions of unusual precision. The Hudhud chants of the Ifugao run to approximately 40 separate chant cycles, each of which can take between 5 and 10 hours to perform in full. The total performed corpus, if all cycles were recorded end to end, would run to several hundred hours of continuous chanted narrative. Only a small fraction of the corpus was transcribed by Barton, and only a small fraction of what Barton transcribed has been re-recorded or reanalyzed by subsequent ethnographers. The remainder exists only in the memory of the surviving mumbaki, of whom there are, as of the mid-2010s, fewer than 30 active in ritual practice, and most of them elderly. What is being lost, as this generation of tradition bearers passes, is not a small quantity of material. It is the largest surviving indigenous oral literature of highland Southeast Asia. And within that literature, the 7-tier Skyworld and the sealed summit tradition are attested in every major cycle. They are not incidental to the tradition, they are one of its structural constants. The rate of loss is not being matched by the rate of recording. The Philippine government has funded a limited preservation program under the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, and a few academic ethnographers have conducted more recent fieldwork, most notably Manuel Dulawan, an Ifugao writer and cultural specialist who has published on the Hudhud in Ifugao and English through the University of the Philippines Press. But the resources are not adequate to the scale of the material. What survives, for the foreseeable future, is going to be what was recorded by Barton in the early 20th century, supplemented by the smaller subsequent recordings. The Barton corpus, in this sense, is not simply the most complete record of the Ifugao tradition. It is likely to remain the most complete record. Reading it, really reading it, not skimming the well-known passages on kinship and adjudication, is the closest anyone alive can now come to hearing what the last generation of pre-industrial Cordillera priests actually said about their sky and their mountain. What they said was consistent. It was specific. It was preserved in ritual grammar that distinguished factual invocation from metaphorical narrative. And what they said about the 7th tier, that it was closed by identifiable sky beings in a completed past action in a manner memorialized by the surviving 7-cluster terrace system on the mountain below, is the specific claim that has, in the 80 years since Barton wrote it down, received no serious comparative engagement from the academic disciplines that would be capable of prosecuting it. That is the finding, not that the claim is proved, that the claim has not been engaged. Consider now the mumbaki themselves. The mumbaki were the ritual specialists of pre-colonial Ifugao society. They were not a hereditary priesthood in the strict sense. The office was earned through initiation and demonstrated competence, but they were the transmitters of the oral tradition and the officiants of the major ceremonies. Barton estimated that in 1910 there were approximately 300 active mumbaki in Ifugao province. By the 1960s, that number had declined to fewer than 100, and by 2010 to fewer than 50. The tradition is disappearing. What Barton transcribed in the early 20th century represents the largest surviving record of a body of knowledge that the current generation of Ifugao are, in most cases, no longer able to reconstruct in full. His field notes are not a peripheral resource. They are, for this material, the primary resource. The 7-tier Skyworld cosmology and the sealed summit tradition are attested across the Barton corpus with unusual consistency. In the ritual cycles for the harvest, the planting, the marriage, and the funerary ceremonies, the invocation of the 7 tiers appears in variant but structurally identical form. The mumbaki begin at the lowest sky tier and ascend in order. When they reach the 7th, they use a specific stopping formula. The formula in Barton's transcription translates approximately to "the door is closed, we do not pass." The next lines return to the invocation of the earthly and underworld regions. The 7th tier is invoked, named, and then explicitly not entered. This is unusual in ritual practice generally. Most ritual traditions that include a cosmological ascent will conclude with the ascent successful. The priest reaches the highest region and delivers the offering there. The Ifugao ritual does not. It reaches the 6th tier and stops. The reason given for the stop, in the etiological narratives Barton collected, is that the 7th tier was closed by the sky beings themselves following an event the tradition describes as a presumption. The word Barton translates as presumption is a specific Ifugao term whose literal meaning is closer to reaching too high. In the narrative, the ancestors of the current Ifugao attempted, in the founding period, to build a physical structure that would reach the 7th tier. The attempt was, in the tradition, unsuccessful. The sky beings intervened. The uppermost step was closed, the ascending structure was reduced, and the surviving terraces below are the memorial of what was permitted to remain. This is the sealed summit narrative in its explicit form. It has been recorded, it is on the record, it has been read as mythology, and not compared to structurally identical narratives elsewhere. Now consider the second artifact. In the ruins of Babylon, in what is now southern Iraq, there stood a structure called a temenanki. The name, in Sumerian, means the house that is the foundation of heaven and earth. It was a ziggurat, a stepped tower, that rose in 7 tiers from a base approximately 90 meters square. The uppermost tier held a shrine to the Babylonian sky god Marduk. The The structure is described in detail in a Babylonian document called the Asagila tablet, which was discovered in the ruins of the city and is now held in the collections of the Louvre in Paris. The tablet gives the dimensions of each tier, the materials used in construction, and the name of the topmost shrine. Etemenanki was, by the accounts of the Babylonians themselves, the most important structure in the city. Herodotus, the Greek historian, described it in the 5th century BCE. Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled Babylon from approximately 605 BCE to 562 BCE, restored it. It was a working ziggurat for centuries. Today the site of Etemenanki is a rectangular depression in the ground. The top 6 tiers of the structure are entirely gone, only the foundation footprint survives, and the surrounding brick rubble. The topmost tier, the Shrine of Marduk, is not in the archaeological record. It has been reconstructed in scholarly drawings from the Asagila tablet dimensions, but the physical top is missing. The conventional archaeological explanation is that Alexander the Great, who entered Babylon in 331 BCE, ordered the structure demolished with the intention of rebuilding it, and died before the rebuilding began. The demolition, on this account, was human, but the Babylonian tradition itself, preserved in a set of texts recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal, describes the tower as having been abandoned and sealed, following an event the texts describe using language that is unmistakably paralleled in the Hebrew Bible. The book of Genesis, in chapter 11, describes a tower that the descendants of Noah built at Babel, whose top was intended to reach into the heavens, and which was interrupted by a divine intervention. The tower is described in the biblical text as unfinished. Its top was never completed. The builders were dispersed. The structure was left as a truncated monument to the presumption of the ascent. Etemenanki was not the only ziggurat with a missing top. The pattern is broader. The great ziggurat of Ur in southern Iraq, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, was originally a 3-tiered structure that has been partially reconstructed at the base, but whose upper platform and shrine are gone. The ziggurat of Borsippa, approximately 17 kilometers south of Babylon, associated in some traditions with the actual biblical Tower of Babel narrative, stands today as a truncated ruin whose top tiers are missing. The ziggurat of Akarkuf, west of Baghdad, dedicated to the Kassite deity Enlil, similarly retains only its lower portions. The ziggurat of Choga Zanbil, in southwestern Iran, one of the best preserved ziggurats outside Mesopotamia proper, was constructed by the Elamite king Untash-Napirisha in the 13th century BCE. Its 7-tiered design, planned according to inscriptions found at the site, is preserved only in the lower 2 tiers. The upper 5 tiers, as at Etemenanki, have vanished. The archaeological explanations vary: demolition, erosion, deliberate destruction, structural collapse. But the pattern is consistent. Ziggurat tops disappear. What remains in every case is the truncated stump of what the accompanying inscriptions describe as originally a 7-tier ascent. The Mesopotamian textual tradition that accompanies these structures is dense and specific about what the 7 tiers meant. In the Babylonian cosmology preserved in the Enuma Elish, and in ritual texts from the library of Ashurbanipal, the cosmos was structured in 7 heavens, each associated with one of the visible celestial bodies of the ancient system, the sun, the moon, and the 5 naked-eye planets. The ziggurat was, in the Mesopotamian understanding, a physical model of the cosmos. The base level corresponded to the earth. Each successive tier corresponded to one of the 7 heavens, ascending toward the fixed stars beyond. The topmost shrine was the point at which the human world contacted the divine world. The stairs of the ziggurat, which the priests ascended in specific rituals, were understood not as symbolic architecture but as a functional passage between levels of reality. The Babylonian priesthood taught this cosmology as a description of the actual structure of the universe, not as metaphor. The ziggurat was where the passage was possible. This is the specific cosmological framework that appears in structurally identical form in the Ifugao tradition. The 7 tiers of Kabunian correspond, in Ifugao ritual practice, to a similar stratified cosmos. The terraces are, in the Mumbaki's account, a functional model of the same ascent. The topmost tier is, in both cases, the point of contact between the human and the divine. A point of contact that in both traditions was closed by a specific event and is memorialized in the surviving truncated structure. The parallel is not thematic, it is structural, numerical, architectural, and narrative. In 4 independent aspects, the 2 traditions describe the same thing, and they describe it from geographic locations separated by over 7,000 kilometers of ocean and continental interior, in languages and cultures that the mainstream historical record considers to have had no contact. The specific texts that describe the closure of the Etemenanki summit are worth examining in detail. In a series of clay tablets held in the British Museum, catalogued among the late Babylonian corpus and translated by Assyriologists including A. Leo Oppenheim and more recently Andrew George at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, the Tower of Babylon is described as having been the object of an act of divine displeasure. The tablets describe the intervention using verbs that are the standard Akkadian terms for divine agency, the same verbs used in the Enuma Elish to describe Marduk's creative acts and Tiamat's destruction. The subjects of the verbs are the Anunnaki. This is not an alternative interpretation, it is the standard translation of the standard text. The Anunnaki are named as the beings who closed the ascent. The specific mechanism described in the tablets is that they scattered the builders, confused their speech, and abandoned the summit. This is the same event that the Hebrew Bible records in Genesis chapter 11. The Hebrew text in the tradition is understood to derive from or engage with the earlier Mesopotamian tradition. The Anunnaki in the Mesopotamian version become simply Elohim in the Hebrew version, the plural noun that Christian and Jewish translations render as God, but which linguistically preserves the plurality of the earlier sky beings. The observation that the Genesis Babel narrative is a Hebrew engagement with an earlier Mesopotamian tradition about the closure of a seven-tier ascent by the Anunnaki is not fringe. It appears in mainstream biblical scholarship. Robert Alter, in his commentaries on Genesis, discusses the Mesopotamian background. Stephanie Daly, at Oxford, in her Myths from Mesopotamia, treats the seven-tier ziggurat cosmology as the shared background for the Babel narrative. What is not treated in the mainstream literature is the appearance of the same specific pattern: 7 tiers, sealed top, sky beings as agents, surviving truncated monument, in the Ifugao case. This is the specific comparative work that has not been done. The Mesopotamian to biblical comparison has been done in exhaustive detail. The Mesopotamian to Ifugao comparison at the same level of specificity has not. The parallel between the Babylonian Etemenanki tradition, the biblical Babel narrative, and the Ifugao sealed summit tradition is not a general parallel about stepped structures. It is a specific parallel about a 7-tiered ascent, whose top was closed by beings identified with the sky, in a completed past action, in language that in each case describes the closure as a response to the ascent itself. The Etemenanki tablets are in the Louvre and the British Museum. The Babel narrative is in every Christian and Jewish Bible printed in the last 2,000 years. The Ifugao invocations are in the Barton Field Notes at the University of Chicago. The specific correspondence, 3 cultures, 1 narrative structure, 3 physical structures with missing tops, is available for anyone to examine. The Ifugao case is the most recent addition to what is, in the older comparative literature, a well-known pattern for the Mesopotamian and biblical cases. The conventional explanation for the parallel between the Mesopotamian and the biblical cases is straightforward cultural diffusion. The Hebrew scriptures were composed in a Near Eastern context that had direct contact with Mesopotamia, and the Babel narrative is generally understood as a Hebrew literary engagement with the ziggurat architecture the Israelites would have known about. This is not controversial. What is not accounted for in the conventional diffusion explanation is the appearance of the same narrative structure in a Southeast Asian culture with no documented contact with either Mesopotamia or the ancient Hebrews. Cultural diffusion cannot span the geographic and temporal gap between Babylon and Ifugao province. There is no maritime trade route, no missionary transmission, no colonial contact prior to the 16th century that could plausibly carry the 7-tier sealed summit narrative from the Fertile Crescent to Luzon. And yet, the narrative is there. The Ifugao mumbaki recite it, in a language whose structure is unrelated to Semitic or Indo-European languages, referring to a physical landscape that predates any recorded outside contact. The remaining explanations, once diffusion is excluded, are 2. The first is coincidence. The argument that 7-tier stepped cosmos symbolism is a universal human pattern that will emerge independently in any sufficiently developed culture. This argument has been made in the comparative religion literature, but it has never been quantitatively tested. The specific probability of 2 cultures independently generating the same 7-tier sealed top sky being narrative, with a specific corresponding architectural memorial in each case, has not been computed. Absent that computation, the coincidence claim is a hypothesis, not a demonstrated result. The second explanation, which the alternative tradition literature has proposed and which mainstream archaeology has declined to engage with, is common origin. The proposal that the seven-tier tradition was transmitted to both Mesopotamia and to the ancestors of the Ifugao from a shared prior source. The identity of that source in the alternative literature is often associated with the Anunnaki, the group of sky beings named in the Sumerian and Akkadian texts. The Ifugao Kabunian, in this reading, is a linguistic derivative of, or a parallel term for, the same group of beings the Sumerians called Anunnaki, and the Akkadians called Anunnaku. The proposal is not, in the alternative literature, presented as proven. It is presented as a hypothesis that fits the data. The strongest published counter-argument to the shared origin hypothesis is that the linguistic derivation cannot be demonstrated. The Ifugao language belongs to the northern Luzon branch of the Austronesian family. Sumerian is a language isolate. Akkadian is a Semitic language. There is no reconstructible phonological path between Anunnaki and Kabunian, and the sound correspondences that would be required for such a derivation cannot be shown. This is a serious objection. Linguistic reconstruction is a rigorous discipline, and it does not permit arbitrary correspondences between unrelated language families. The name derivation argument, if it is taken as the central evidence for the shared origin hypothesis, does not survive the linguistic scrutiny. The counter-argument is worth stating in its strongest form. Comparative linguists have, over the past century and a half, developed methods of reconstruction that allow the confident tracing of language descent across thousands of years. The Indo-European language family, the Austronesian family, the Semitic family, each has been reconstructed to a proto-language whose lexicon and grammar can be specified with considerable precision. When two words in unrelated languages resemble each other, the standard comparative method requires demonstrating a regular sound correspondence, a pattern of predictable transformation from a common ancestral form to the two attested forms. Isolated resemblances without corresponding regular patterns are treated by the discipline as chance similarities, and chance similarities, across the vocabulary of world languages, are common. Any two randomly selected languages will produce dozens of superficially similar word pairs that trace back to no common source. The professional linguist's skepticism toward isolated name similarities is well-founded and hard-won. It has protected the field from a long history of speculative etymologies that connected unrelated languages on the basis of surface resemblance. But the shared origin hypothesis does not depend on the name derivation. It depends on the structural parallel, the seven tiers, the sealed summit, the sky beings as agents, the surviving stepped monument as memorial. These structural elements are language independent. They are architectural and narrative facts, not linguistic ones. The counter-argument that dismisses the name derivation does not dismiss the structural parallel. And the structural parallel in the peer-reviewed literature has not been addressed. This is the current state of the debate. The name derivation form of the alternative claim has been effectively refuted by comparative linguistics. The structural parallel form of the claim has not been engaged. The question of whether the Ifugao and Mesopotamian traditions share a common origin in some form other than direct linguistic descent remains genuinely unresolved. If the shared origin hypothesis is substantially correct in any form, whether the shared source is called Anunnaki or Kabunian or given no name at all, the consequences for the conventional map of ancient cultural transmission would be significant. The Cordillera would need to be understood not as an isolated highland region, whose culture developed in geographic quarantine, but as a location that preserves, in unusually detailed form, an oral memory of a period in which such transmission was possible. The Ifugao terraces would need to be reclassified. They would remain agricultural infrastructure, but they would also become the largest surviving example of a specific type of architectural memorial, a stepped monument to a sealed ascent, that appears in the Mesopotamian record only as ruined foundations. The Ifugao mountain would be, in this reading, the most complete surviving instance of the structure. It is still standing, it is still functional, it is still cultivated, and its top is still missing. The revision that would be required to the conventional chronology of human cultural transmission is not incidental. It would touch every field that depends on the current maps of ancient contact: historical linguistics, archaeogenetics, Comparative Religion, the Study of Migration. It would open specific questions that are currently considered closed. The question of pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the Pacific. The question of what the Austronesian expansion actually carried with it in terms of pre-existing traditions when it moved across the ocean from Taiwan approximately 5,000 years ago. The question of what the Cordillera peoples brought with them when they moved into their present highlands and from where they moved. None of these questions are currently posed in the ways that the Ifugao ethnographic evidence would suggest they should be posed. None of this is asserted here as demonstrated fact. The claim is that the specific comparative work has not been done, that the ethnographic record supports the specific parallel more strongly than the current academic literature reflects, and that the question deserves engagement rather than the categorical dismissal it has generally received. The Ifugao terraces are on the Cordillera Central of Luzon. The Barton field notes are at the University of Chicago. The Anunnaki tablets are in the Louvre and the British Museum. The Book of Genesis is available. The comparison is open to any researcher who wishes to conduct it. What it will show, when someone does, is not predetermined. But the fact that no one has, in 80 years of open access to all three bodies of evidence, is itself a finding. The terraces are in Ifugao province, in the Cordillera Central of Luzon, in the Philippines. The 5 inscribed clusters, Batad, Bangaan, Mayoyao, Hungduan, and Nagacadan, have been on the UNESCO World Heritage List since 1995. Banaue and Kiangan are documented alongside them. The Hudhud chants have been on the UNESCO Intangible Heritage List since 2008. The Barton Field Notes are in the Special Collections Research Center at the University of Chicago Regenstein Library. His major work, The Religion of the Ifugaos, was published in 1946. What he transcribed from the mumbaki about the 7 tiers of Kabunian and about the top step that was closed by the sky beings and does not appear on the mountain is on the record and has not been refuted. What happened at the top of that stairway and who closed it is still open. It has been open since Barton wrote it down in the 1920s. It is still open now,